There are people who, after several relationships, come to exactly the same conclusion. I always fall in love with the same type of person. At first, they seem attentive, affectionate, interested, and even feel like they finally found someone different. But as the months go by, everything changes. The lies begin, the manipulation, the indifference, the jealousy, the emotional abandonment, or even different types of violence. And when the relationship ends, they make a promise. Next time, I'll choose better. But months later, they fall in love again with someone surprisingly similar. Then a very painful question arises: what's wrong with me? The answer offered by evidence based psychology is often very different. Maybe the problem isn't that you choose poorly. Maybe your brain learned many years ago to confuse certain patterns with safety, and that completely changes the conversation because now we're no longer talking about bad luck, we're talking about learning. There's an idea that tends to make us uncomfortable when we hear it for the first time. People don't always feel attracted to what's best for us. Many times we feel attracted to what our nervous system recognizes. If you grew up in an environment where affection was unpredictable, where sometimes you received love and other times rejection, where you constantly had to strive for attention, or where love depended on meeting expectations, that model can become the template your brain uses to learn what it means to love. Years later, when you meet someone who reproduces part of this dynamic, a strange feeling arises. Not necessarily calmness, but familiarity. And the brain often interprets that familiarity as if it were compatibility. The problem is that familiar doesn't always mean healthy. Many times it simply means known. When someone says, "With that person I felt an immediate connection," we usually think that's a good sign. But from the perspective of trauma psychology, we need to ask a different question. Where does that intensity come from? In some relationships, that so-called chemistry appears because the other person triggers old emotional wounds. Uncertainty, the need for approval, fear of abandonment, the constant search for validation. All of that generates a huge activation of the nervous system, and that activation can be mistaken for being in love. That's why some people say, "I've never felt something so strong," and at the same time live with constant anxiety. They check their phone every few minutes, fear being replaced, analyze every message, and interpret any silence as a threat. That isn't necessarily love. Many times, it's a nervous system that learned that loving means living on alert. One of the hardest questions to answer in therapy is the following: if that person hurt me so much, why do I still miss them? The answer is usually not about the other person. It is usually found in the story that your nervous system is still trying to resolve. In psychology, there is a phenomenon known as repetition compulsion. It doesn't mean that people want to suffer. It means that the brain tends to recreate situations similar to those experienced in the past, with the unconscious hope that this time the outcome will be different. It's as if the nervous system were saying, maybe now I'll finally get the love I didn't receive before. Maybe now I'll finally get someone to choose me. Maybe now I'll be able to prove that I am enough. That's why many people don't look for exactly the same person. They look for the same dynamic. They change the names, the cities, the ages, but the emotional pattern remains almost unchanged. And as long as that pattern isn't understood, it's very likely that it will repeat itself. Imagine someone only showed you affection on certain days. One day they shower you with attention, the next they disappear. Then they come back saying they miss you. Later they distance themselves again. From the outside, it seems obvious that this relationship is harmful, but from the inside, something much more complex is happening. The uncertainty keeps the nervous system in a permanent state of alert. Every small gesture of affection brings enormous relief, and that relief can feel extremely intense because it comes after a long period of anxiety. Over time, the brain starts to associate those moments of relief with a very valuable reward. Not because the relationship is healthy, but because the contrast between suffering and affection makes those moments seem much more intense. That's why some people describe these relationships as impossible to forget. Not necessarily because they received more love, but because they experienced a constant cycle of tension, uncertainty, and relief. And that cycle can strengthen the emotional bond even when the relationship is destroying their well-being. When we meet someone, we believe we are making completely rational decisions, but much of our perception happens before we are even aware of it. Our brain evaluates facial expressions, tones of voice, ways of approaching, levels of emotional availability, and compares all of that with previous experiences. If for years you learned that love meant having to work hard to be noticed, that you had to compete for attention, that you had to endure rejection to receive affection, it's possible that an emotionally available person won't spark a strong feeling of excitement. On the other hand, someone who is distant, ambiguous, or unpredictable can immediately spark your interest, not because they're a better partner, but because your nervous system recognizes that pattern as familiar. And here a very important idea comes up. The famous butterflies in your stomach are not always a sign of compatibility. For some people, they can be the manifestation of a nervous system entering a state of alert. That's why the goal of healing isn't just about learning to spot toxic people. It's also about transforming the filter through which we choose them. Because when your nervous system changes, what you find attractive also changes. There's an idea that often surprises people when they start therapy. Not only do your relationships change, but the type of people you start to like also changes. At first, this seems impossible. Many people believe that attraction is something completely spontaneous and can't be changed. But the evidence shows us something different. Our brain learns associations throughout our entire life, and those associations can also change. When a person begins to heal their trauma, they develop better emotional regulation and build a more stable self-esteem. Something very interesting starts to happen. Behaviors that once seemed mysterious or irresistible begin to look different. Indifference stops seeming interesting. Manipulation is no longer mistaken for confidence. Intensity stops feeling romantic. And little by little, something that once seemed strange appears: calm. Many people even end up saying, "Before, I would have loved that person. Today, I'm no longer interested." That doesn't mean they've lost the ability to love. It means that the filter through which they interpret relationships has changed. And that change is one of the clearest signs of recovery. There's another very common myth, thinking that healing means never feeling fear again. That doesn't happen. We all feel fear, we all experience insecurity at times. The difference lies in how our nervous system responds. When a person has worked through their trauma, they stop interpreting every difference of opinion as a threat of abandonment. They no longer need to constantly check their phone to feel at ease. They can tolerate uncertainty without automatically imagining the worst-case scenario. They can set boundaries without feeling unbearable guilt. They can express their needs without believing they will be rejected for doing so. Not because life has become perfect, but because the brain has learned a new way to relate. It learned that love doesn't have to hurt to be real, that a difficult conversation doesn't mean the end of the relationship, that someone who is emotionally available isn't boring, they're safe. And when the nervous system starts to experience that sense of safety repeatedly, neural connections change. That is precisely what we know as neuroplasticity. The brain stops responding solely from the past. It begins to respond from the reality of the present. If after watching this video you could only take away one idea, I would like it to be the following. Stop asking yourself, what is it about that person that always makes me fall in love with someone like that? And instead, start asking yourself, what did my nervous system learn about love? Because the answer probably isn't in your last partner. Maybe it started many years ago in the way you learned to receive affection, in how conflicts were resolved at home, in whether you could express emotions without fear, in whether you felt seen, heard, and protected. Understanding this doesn't mean blaming your parents or justifying the behavior of those who hurt you. It means understanding where your patterns come from so you can transform them. And that's a huge difference, because what you don't understand tends to repeat itself, but what you do understand can start to change. Maybe you can't change the relationships you've already experienced, but you can change the decisions you make from today onward. You can learn to identify signs of safety instead of chasing intensity. You can build connections where you don't have to constantly prove that you deserve to be loved. And you can discover something that many people with complex trauma never imagined possible, that the most stable love usually doesn't feel like a roller coaster. It feels like a place where, for the first time, your nervous system can finally rest. And maybe that's the greatest sign that you're healing. Not that you've stopped loving, but that you finally learned to choose a love that no longer forces you to just survive.